Let me tell you what happened in a basement in Yekaterinburg. It was July 17th, 1918, 1003 in the morning. A family was woken from their sleep and told to dress quickly. They were being moved, their captors said, for their own safety. The White Army was approaching and the streets weren't secure. The family believed this. They had been prisoners for months, shuttled from palace to house to this final destination, a merchant's villa the Bolsheviks had renamed the House of Special Purpose. They had learned to follow orders, to hope, to wait for rescue that kept being promised but never came. 11 people filed down into the basement. The former Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, his wife, Alexandra. Their 5 children, Olga, 22, Tatiana, 21, Maria, 19, Anastasia, 17, and Alexei, 13, carried in his father's arms because he couldn't walk. The hemophilia that had shaped their entire dynasty's fate had flared again. With them came 4 loyal servants who had chosen to stay: Dr. Eugene Botkin, the court physician, Anna Demidova, the chambermaid clutching a pillow, Ivan Karatanov, the cook, Alexei Trupp, the footman. They hadn't been forced to come. They'd refused to leave. There were none, so they stood, the healthy ones, the 4 grand duchesses in a row behind their mother, the servants against the back wall, Nicholas in front, still somehow dignified, still somehow regal, even now. They waited, and then the doors opened, and 11 armed men walked in. The leader's name was Yakov Yurovsky. He was a watchmaker's son, a committed Bolshevik, a man who believed absolutely in what he was about to do. He had a piece of paper in his hand. In view of the fact that your relatives in Europe continue their assault on Soviet Russia, he read, the Ural Regional Soviet has sentenced you to be shot. Nicholas didn't understand at first, or maybe he understood perfectly and simply couldn't believe it. He turned toward his family, then back to Yurovsky. His last words were either "what" or "you know not what you do." The accounts differ, it doesn't matter. Yurovsky raised his pistol and shot the Tsar in the chest. And then everything became chaos. The execution squad opened fire. 11 guns in a small basement room. The sound deafening. The smoke blinding. They had been assigned specific targets, 1 killer for each victim, but discipline broke down immediately. Several guards disobeyed orders and shot Nicholas first instead of their assigned targets. Others couldn't see through the gunsmoke. Others simply panicked. The Tsarina and Olga died quickly, bullets to the head. But something strange was happening with the others. The bullets weren't killing them. The daughters were still alive, still screaming, still moving, even as round after round was pumped into them, the room filled with smoke. And the guards couldn't understand why these girls wouldn't die. They didn't know about the diamonds. Over the preceding months, as the family's situation had grown more desperate, the Empress had sewn jewels into her daughters' corsets. Diamonds, rubies, pearls, a fortune in gemstones. Hidden in the undergarments of 4 young women, it was meant to help them, if they escaped, if they were rescued, if somehow they found their way to safety. They would need money. They would need something to sell. The jewels were hope, crystallized and hidden against their skin. Instead, the jewels became armor. The bullets struck the corsets and ricocheted. The diamonds deflected shots that should have been fatal. The girls were wounded. The girls were wounded, bleeding, terrified, but alive. The guards ran out of ammunition. The room was thick with smoke and screams and the smell of blood. The bodies lay everywhere, some dead, some dying, some somehow still conscious. The men resorted to bayonets. They stabbed the survivors. Tatiana, Maria, the maid Demidova, who fought back with her pillow until they cornered her against the wall. Alexei, who was still somehow alive despite everything, shot twice more in the head at point-blank range. And Anastasia. She had been knocked unconscious by the initial volley or had fainted from terror. When a guard approached her body to move it, she suddenly came to, screaming, struggling, reaching out with hands that found nothing to hold on to. They stabbed her until she stopped. Some accounts say it took 20 minutes for everyone to die, some say 30. The guards couldn't agree afterward. Time moves differently in places like that. When it was finally over, 11 bodies lay in a basement awash with blood. The 300-year Romanov dynasty had ended in half an hour of botched murder. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. In 1997, an animated film was released. You probably know it. A red-haired girl named Anya discovers she's really a lost princess. She reunites with her grandmother. She defeats the villain Rasputin. She falls in love. She lives happily ever after. The film made $140 million. It spawned a Broadway musical. To this day, it's many people's first introduction to the Romanov story. A romantic fantasy about a girl who escaped impossible circumstances and found her way home. It's a beautiful lie. And tonight, we need to ask ourselves why we need it. Why, of all the children murdered in that basement, did Anastasia become the one we couldn't let die? Why did her story spawn decades of imposters, each claiming to have escaped the bullets and the bayonets? Why did we need so desperately to believe that someone, anyone, got out? The answer, I think, has less to do with Anastasia than with us. We can't bear the alternative. We can't accept that sometimes evil wins completely. That sometimes the bad guys shoot the children and get away with it. That sometimes there is no rescue, no escape, no last-minute miracle to redeem the horror. The Anastasia myth is the story we tell ourselves because the truth is unbearable. A 17-year-old girl was murdered in a basement, and we've spent a century pretending she wasn't. Tonight, we're going to meet the real Anastasia, not the cartoon, not the imposters who claimed her name, not the myth, the girl who died. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these forgotten stories are worth remembering, if you believe the real lives behind the myths deserve to be told, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps these stories alive. Every view, every subscription, every share helps us dig deeper into the past that others would prefer to sanitize or forget. Tonight, we will trace the short life of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna. From her birth in a palace where her parents wept that she wasn't a boy, to the basement where she died with diamonds sewn into her dress, we will meet her family. The weak father who loved his children but couldn't save his country. The mother obsessed with her son's disease. The 4 sisters who signed their letters OTMA and promised to stay together forever. We will follow them through revolution and exile, through the house of special purpose, through the bullets and the bayonets and the acid and the shallow graves. And then we will meet the women who claimed to be her. Anna Anderson, pulled from a Berlin canal at 1920, who spent 60 years insisting she was the missing Grand Duchess. Eugenia Smith, who wrote an autobiography of her supposed life as Anastasia. The parade of imposters who couldn't let the princess die. We will watch as science slowly closed the door on hope. The DNA tests in 1994. the discovery of the final bodies in 2007. We will see how the myth persisted even after the evidence was irrefutable, and we will ask the question that has haunted this story for more than a century. Why couldn't we let her go? Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov was born on June 18, 1901, and her family was devastated. Not because anything was wrong with her. She was healthy, alert, with the blue eyes that ran in the family. By all accounts, a perfect baby. She was also the fourth girl in a row. You have to understand what this meant in the context of Russian imperial succession. The Pauline laws, established by Emperor Paul I more than a century earlier, dictated that only males could inherit the throne. Nicholas II had no son. He had 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and now Anastasia, and no heir. His aunt, Grand Duchess Xenia, wrote in her diary, "My God, what a disappointment! A 4th girl." Nicholas himself needed time to compose himself before visiting his wife and newborn child. The travel writer Burton Holmes noted that Nicholas would part with half his empire in exchange for 1 imperial boy. The celebrations that should have accompanied a Grand Duchess's birth were muted. The cannon salute was shorter than it would have been for a boy. The champagne was drunk with forced smiles. Into this atmosphere of disappointment, Anastasia learned to exist. But here's the thing about being born a disappointment. It can be liberating. Her older sisters felt the weight of imperial expectation. They were being groomed for marriages that would strengthen alliances. They were watched and judged and prepared for futures as queens. Anastasia, the spare of the spares, was largely left alone, and she used that freedom to become exactly who she was. The servants called her Schwibzik. It means little imp in German. It suited her perfectly. From the moment she could walk, Anastasia was chaos in human form. She climbed trees in her court dresses and refused to come down. She hid in cupboards to jump out at unsuspecting maids. She tripped servants and put rocks in snowballs and melted chocolate in her pockets during formal events just so she could watch the mess it made. Gleb Botkin, the son of the family physician, would later write that she undoubtedly held the record for punishable deeds in her family, for in naughtiness she was a true genius. She was short for her age and inclined toward chubbiness, nothing like the elegant, ethereal princess of the animated film. Her tutors, Pierre Gilliard and Sidney Gibbs, found her bright but completely uninterested in the restrictions of formal education. She would rather be making people laugh, and she was very, very good at making people laugh. She had a gift for mimicry. She could imitate her relatives, her tutors, the court officials who came to visit, not cruelly but with an accuracy that delighted everyone except the person being imitated. She organized theatrical performances with her siblings, and her comic timing always brought down the house. Her sharp wit could sometimes wound. One cousin, Princess Nina Georgievna, called her nasty to the point of being evil. But most who knew her remembered the humor rather than the sting. She was too charming to stay mad at, too funny, too alive. She was, by all accounts, her father's favorite. Nicholas, burdened by an empire he couldn't control, and a wife increasingly consumed by their son's illness, found in Anastasia something uncomplicated, a child who made him smile. "My darling, sweet, dear papa," she would write to him, "I salute you. I kiss your hands and feet 1,000,000 times." She signed her letters with flourishes and exclamation points, like everything else in her life. Anastasia was part of a unit. The 4 Romanov sisters called themselves Atma, a name derived from their first initials. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. They signed letters with it. They made decisions together. They were, in many ways, a single entity divided into 4 bodies. But within Atma, there were subdivisions. Olga and Tatiana were the big pair. Older, more serious, more conscious of their duties. Olga was moody and intellectual, the most aware of how precarious their position really was. Tatiana was practical and organized, her mother's right hand, the one who kept everything running. Anastasia and Maria were the little pair. They shared a bedroom with walls painted gray and ceilings decorated with butterflies. They wore matching dresses. They developed their own language of jokes and references that left everyone else confused. Maria was gentle and sweet, so sweet that she would follow behind Anastasia to apologize to whoever her sister had just offended. Anastasia was the instigator, Maria was the diplomat. They slept on hard camp beds, a tradition dating back to Catherine the Great. They took cold baths to build character. Despite being princesses of the wealthiest family in Europe, their rooms were sparse, their lives strictly scheduled. They woke early, breakfast at 9, lessons until lunch, tea at 5, dinner, prayers, bed. It was, in many ways, an ordinary childhood, just one that happened to take place in palaces surrounded by servants and guards, and the weight of 300 years of dynastic history. The girls knew, on some level, that they were different, that their lives were circumscribed by protocol and protected by privilege. But children adapt to their circumstances. This was simply their normal until 1904, when everything changed. On August 12, 1904, after 4 daughters and nearly a decade of trying, Alexandra finally gave birth to a son, Alexei Nikolaevich, the Tsarevich, the heir to the Russian throne. The relief was overwhelming. The cannon salutes went on forever. The celebrations were genuine. The succession was secured. The Romanov dynasty would continue for about 6 weeks. Then the bleeding started. Alexei had inherited hemophilia from his mother's side, the disease that had claimed so many male descendants of Queen Victoria. His blood couldn't clot properly. A minor bump could cause internal bleeding that lasted for days. A small cut could be life-threatening. Any accident, any fall, any childhood roughhousing could kill him. Alexandra's response to this diagnosis consumed the rest of her life. She became obsessed with protecting her son, obsessed with finding a cure, obsessed, eventually, with the one person who seemed able to ease his suffering, a Siberian peasant faith healer named Grigory Rasputin. The girls watched their mother retreat into this obsession, watched their household reshape itself around their brother's fragility, watched their parents' attention, never abundant to begin with, focus even more narrowly on the boy who might die at any moment. Anastasia, in particular, seemed to have a special bond with Alexei. Perhaps it was because they were closest in age. Perhaps it was their similar temperaments. He was as mischievous as she was when his health allowed. Perhaps she simply refused to treat him as the delicate invalid everyone else saw. She made him laugh. She distracted him from his pain. She was the one sibling who seemed to communicate with him without words, to sense what he needed before he asked. When the darkness finally came for the Romanovs, she would die reaching for him. By 1914, the Romanov court was haunted by Rasputin. You've heard of him. You probably know the legend, the mad monk, the evil genius, the man who controlled the empress through hypnotism or sex or dark magic. The animated film turned him into a literal sorcerer, a villain who sold his soul and led an army of demons. The truth was both more mundane and more disturbing. Rasputin was a peasant holy man who discovered he could stop Alexei's bleeding episodes. How exactly remains unclear. Perhaps it was hypnosis. He would sit by the boy's bed and talk to him in a low, calm voice until the child relaxed and the hemorrhaging slowed. Perhaps it was coincidence. The episodes would eventually stop on their own, and Rasputin happened to be present when they did. Perhaps it was something unexplainable. What mattered was that Alexandra believed he could save her son, and that belief gave Rasputin unprecedented access to the Russian imperial family. He dined with them. He advised them. He recommended appointments to government positions. His influence over the Empress and through her, the Tsar, became the subject of vicious rumors. People whispered about orgies, about demonic pacts, about a peasant who had bewitched the most powerful woman in Russia. The four Grand Duchesses had complicated relationships with this strange figure in their midst. He called them by nicknames, blessed them, sometimes offered advice about their health or their spiritual lives. There's no evidence anything inappropriate occurred, but the intimacy itself was scandalous. Rasputin was murdered in December 1916, poisoned and shot and drowned by nobles who thought they were saving Russia. By then, it was far too late. The damage to the dynasty's reputation was done. The association with this mystical peasant had convinced much of Russia that the imperial family was either corrupt or insane. When the revolution came 3 months later, Rasputin was one of the charges against them. The mad monk, the evil influence, the proof that the Romanovs were unfit to rule. The real Rasputin died in a river in St. Petersburg. The cartoon Rasputin lived on, convenient shorthand for everything that went wrong with Russia's last imperial family, February 1917. The Russian Empire was collapsing. The war with Germany had been catastrophic, millions of soldiers dead, food shortages at home, a transportation system breaking down, a government that couldn't govern. Protests filled the streets of Petrograd, workers went on strike, soldiers mutinied. The Duma, the parliament, demanded change. Nicholas was at military headquarters when it happened. The man who had never wanted to be Tsar, who had told his father he didn't know how to be Tsar, who had spent his entire reign wishing he could be anywhere else, he wasn't even in the capital when his empire fell apart. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. He signed the paper, put down his pen, and said simply, "What difference does it make? They have deceived me again." He had intended to pass the crown to his son, but Alexei was too sick. So instead, the throne went to Nicholas's brother Michael, who immediately refused it. No Romanov wanted to catch this falling knife. The dynasty was over. Nicholas returned home to his family at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. He found his children sick with measles, all of them, one after another, confined to their beds. Anastasia was the last to fall ill. By the time she recovered, the family was under house arrest. They were prisoners now, guarded, watched, restricted in their movements. But they were still together, still a family, still hopeful that some resolution would come. Exiled to England, perhaps, where their cousins ruled, or refuge in Denmark, where Nicholas's mother had fled. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their cousin, King George V, had been asked to give them asylum and had refused. The political risks were too great. The Tsar's unpopularity might spread. Better to let them find their own way out. There was no way out. August 1917. The family was moved. The provisional government, the moderate socialists who had taken over after Nicholas's abdication, decided that Petrograd was too dangerous for the former royals. There were radicals who wanted them dead. There were monarchists who might try to rescue them. Better to send them somewhere remote, somewhere quiet, somewhere the problem could be contained. They chose Tobolsk, a town in Siberia, more than 2,000 miles from the capital. The governor's mansion became their new prison, 13 rooms for the imperial family and their reduced household staff. It was, by the standards of what was coming, almost pleasant. They had books, they had servants, they had space to walk in the enclosed garden. They could hold religious services. They could be a family. The girls put on plays for their parents, comedies that made everyone laugh. Anastasia always stealing scenes with her timing. They helped with household chores, something they'd never had to do before. They worked in a kitchen garden, growing vegetables. They taught themselves to cook and mend and do laundry. Anastasia characteristically turned even captivity into material for humor. Guards remembered her as cheerful, full of life, always ready with a joke or a funny face. But the situation was deteriorating. In November, the Bolsheviks seized power from the provisional government. Lenin's revolution had succeeded. Russia was now in the hands of men who had no interest in clemency toward the old regime. By spring 1918, the family was moved again. This time, the destination was Yekaterinburg, deeper into the Urals, closer to the advancing White Army, closer to their end. They went in two groups, Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria first in April. The others followed in May, after Alexei had recovered enough to travel. When the second group arrived at the Ipatiev house, they found something had changed. The Ipatiev house was a merchant's villa that had been requisitioned by the Ural Soviet. They'd built a high wooden fence around it, blocking all view from the street. They'd whitewashed the windows so no one could see in or out. They'd stationed guards at every entrance. They called it the House of Special Purpose. The family was confined to 4 rooms on the upper floor. The guards occupied the ground floor. There would be no garden walks here, no theater performances, no pretense that this was anything other than imprisonment. The commandant, a man named Yakov Yurovsky, ran the house like the prison it was. Wake up at a fixed time, meals at fixed times, limited exercise in the small courtyard, every moment accounted for. The windows stayed sealed and whitewashed. The summer of 1908 was unusually hot, and the family sweltered in their rooms, unable to open the windows, barely able to breathe. Some of the guards were kind. Alexander Strikotin remembered Anastasia as very friendly and full of fun. Another guard called her a very charming devil who was mischievous and, I think, rarely tired. Other guards were hostile. One described her as offensive and a terrorist whose provocative comments caused tension in the ranks. But kind or hostile, the guards were there for a purpose. The family was being held as hostages. The Ural Soviet had made this explicit. Any attempt at counter-revolutionary action in the town would result in summary execution. The question wasn't whether they were in danger. The question was when the danger would arrive. In late June, something happened that sealed the family's fate. Letters began arriving at the Ipatiev house. They were written in French, smuggled past the guards, and they offered hope. A group of loyal officers was planning a rescue. The family should be ready to flee at a moment's notice. The Romanovs responded. They wrote back, confirming their willingness to attempt escape. They provided details about the house, the guards, the routine. They prepared themselves for the moment when their saviors would come. They didn't know the letters were fake. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, had written them. It was a trap. The government needed justification for what they were planning to do. By soliciting the family's cooperation in an escape attempt, they created the evidence they needed. The Romanovs were plotting against the Soviet state. They were corresponding with counter-revolutionary forces. They were a threat that had to be eliminated. On July 14th, 2 days before the end, a priest was allowed to conduct a service for the family. Father Ivan Staroshev would later describe the experience as haunting. The family sang the liturgy with unusual intensity. There was, he said, an eerie sense of doom in the room. It was as though they were sharing, knowingly, in their own last rites. The night of July 16th, the family went to bed early. The next time they would be woken, it would be to die. At 10:30 a.m. on July 17th, Dr. Botkin received a knock on his door. The family needed to dress quickly, he was told. They were being moved. The White Army was approaching, and the house wasn't safe. Botkin woke the others. The family dressed. They packed a few belongings. They probably believed what they were told, that this was another transfer, another prison, another holding pattern, until their fate could be determined. Alexandra asked for chairs. Her sciatica was acting up. Alexei couldn't stand. Nicholas carried him down the stairs. The guards led them through a courtyard and into the basement. The room was bare, except for 2 chairs that were brought in for the Tsarina and the Tsarevich. The family arranged themselves, Nicholas in front. Alexandra and Alexei seated, the 4 daughters behind their mother, the servants against the back wall. Anna Demidova, the chambermaid, held a pillow in her arms. Inside it, she had hidden the last of the family's jewels. They waited. Yurovsky entered with his execution squad. He had a paper in his hand. Someone, accounts differ on who, asked what was happening. Yurovsky read the sentence. Nicholas said his final words. Yurovsky raised his pistol. And then everything happened very fast and very slow at the same time. The plan was simple. 11 executioners, 11 targets. Each man had been assigned someone to kill. Quick, clean, efficient. Nothing went according to plan. The first volley of shots killed Nicholas, Alexandra, and Olga, but the bullets that hit the other daughters ricocheted off the diamonds sewn into their corsets. The girls screamed and fell but didn't die. The room filled with smoke. The guards couldn't see their targets. Some fired wildly, some ran out of ammunition. The noise was overwhelming. Gunshots echoing off stone walls, screaming, shouting, the sound of bodies hitting the floor. Maria tried to escape. She ran for the doors and was shot in the thigh, then shot again. Demidova fought back with her pillow until they cornered her against the wall and bayoneted her. Botkin was shot but didn't die immediately. He lay on the floor breathing until someone finished him with a pistol shot to the head. Alexei was still alive after the initial shooting. He lay on the floor groaning. Yurovsky shot him twice in the head. Tatiana was stabbed. Maria was stabbed. Anastasia had been knocked unconscious by the initial chaos. When a guard approached her body, she suddenly woke, screaming and flailing. They stabbed her repeatedly until she stopped moving. The killing took somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. The executioners were drunk. The room was filled with smoke and blood and the smell of gunpowder. When it was finally over, 11 bodies lay on the floor. The 300-year Romanov dynasty had ended in a basement, but disposing of the bodies would prove almost as difficult as killing them. The original plan was to dump the bodies in an abandoned mine shaft. A truck was waiting. The guards loaded the corpses and drove into the Koptyaki forest. But when they arrived at the mine, they discovered a problem. The shaft wasn't deep enough. The bodies would be found. The evidence would be discovered. The secret wouldn't stay secret. They tried to destroy the bodies with acid and fire. They tried to burn them. They tried to collapse the mine shaft. Nothing worked well enough. By the next morning, Yurovsky realized they needed a new plan. He ordered the bodies transported to a different location, a marshy area along a road where the truck conveniently got stuck. They dug a shallow pit. They poured acid over the corpses to disfigure them. They buried 9 of the bodies there, in layers, but not all 9 in the same place. 2 bodies, Alexei and one of his sisters, were buried separately, about 70 meters away. Perhaps this was intentional to confuse anyone who might find the grave. Perhaps it was simply haste, the dawn approaching and the work unfinished. The sister buried separately was probably Maria, based on later forensic analysis. But for decades, there was another theory, a theory that kept hope alive and launched 1,000 imposters. The missing body might have been Anastasia. The Bolshevik government faced a problem. They had murdered the Tsar of Russia and his entire family. This was, by any standard, a significant political act, one that would define how the new Soviet state was perceived by the world. So they lied. The initial announcement, released days after the execution, stated only that Nicholas had been shot. His wife and son, the government claimed, had been moved to a secure location. The fate of the daughters wasn't mentioned at all. This selective disclosure was strategic. Lenin had ordered the execution, but he understood the optics of killing children. Better to let the world assume they'd survived. Better to leave the door open for plausible deniability. The result was confusion. Rumors spread immediately. The Tsar was dead. But what about the others? Some said they'd been rescued. Some said they'd escaped during the chaos of the execution. Some said they'd been smuggled out of Russia entirely and were living in exile somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. The Soviet government, which knew the truth, said nothing to correct these theories. The silence served them. As long as no one knew what had really happened, no one could hold them fully accountable. For years, then decades, the fate of the Romanov children remained officially uncertain. And into that uncertainty walked the impostors. Of the 5 Romanov children, Anastasia became the focus of the survival myths. Not Olga, the eldest and most serious. Not Tatiana, the practical one, the organizer. Not Maria, the beauty with eyes like saucers. Not even Alexei, the heir to the throne, whose survival would have had the greatest political implications. Anastasia, the mischievous one, the funny one, the imp. Why her? Part of the answer is practical. When the first mass grave was discovered in 1991, it contained only 9 bodies: the Tsar, the Tsarina, 3 daughters, and the 4 servants. 2 of the children were missing. Forensic analysis initially couldn't determine which daughter was absent, and some experts argued it was Anastasia. But the myth predates the forensic evidence. People were claiming to be Anastasia as early as 1920, long before anyone had found any bodies at all. Perhaps it was her age. At 17, she was the youngest of the daughters, young enough to seem vulnerable, young enough that people could imagine her surviving through sheer scrappy determination. Perhaps it was her personality, the stories of her mischievousness, her humor, her refusal to follow rules. These suggested someone who might find a way out when others couldn't. Perhaps it was simply that she was the most recent in people's memories, the baby of the family, the one who should have had her whole life ahead of her. Or perhaps the answer is darker. Perhaps we needed to believe that someone escaped the basement because the alternative, that they all died, that evil one completely, that there was no miracle, was unbearable. Anastasia became our collective hope, the princess who might have lived, the happy ending we couldn't stop looking for. Some were clearly mentally ill, confused about their own identities. Some were con artists, hoping to access the Romanov fortune, rumored to be held in foreign banks. Some may have genuinely believed their own claims. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the 20th century, at least a dozen women publicly claimed to be Anastasia. More made private claims or were identified by others as the missing princess. They couldn't all be her. They couldn't even mostly be her. At most, one could be telling the truth, and probably none of them were, but the claims kept coming. There was Eugenia Smith, who wrote an entire autobiography of her supposed life as Anastasia, and then there was Anna Anderson, February 17, 1920. Berlin, Germany. A young woman jumped off the Bendler Bridge into the Landwehr Canal. She was pulled from the water by a police sergeant who happened to be nearby. She was taken to a hospital. She refused to identify herself. For 2 years, she was known only as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't explain who she was or why she'd tried to kill herself. The authorities couldn't identify her. No one came forward to claim her. She was transferred to the Dahldorf Asylum, where she continued her silence. She had scars on her body, evidence of wounds that might have come from bullets or bayonets. She spoke German, but with an accent that some found strange. She was clearly traumatized by something. And then, in 1922, a fellow patient at the asylum started a rumor. Clara Puthert noticed the mysterious woman's resemblance to photographs of the Russian Imperial family. She began telling people that Miss Unknown was actually Grand Duchess Tatiana, somehow escaped from the massacre. The young woman initially denied it. Then, when pressed, she said she wasn't Tatiana. She was the youngest daughter. She was Anastasia. Anna Anderson, as she eventually came to be known, told a remarkable story. She claimed that on the night of the execution, she had been shielded from the bullets by her sister Tatiana's body. She was stabbed, but not killed. When the guards loaded the bodies onto the truck, she was still alive. A soldier named Alexander Tchaikovsky discovered she was breathing. He hid her, treated her wounds, and smuggled her out of Russia through Romania. She married him. They had a child. He was killed in a street fight. The child was placed in an orphanage. Eventually, she made her way to Berlin, alone and traumatized, where she tried to end her life in the canal. It was a dramatic story. It was also unverifiable. Tchaikovsky was conveniently dead. The child couldn't be traced. The escape route had left no evidence. But Anna had something that made people believe. She knew things. She knew the names of the Romanov dogs. She knew details about palace life that seemed impossible for an outsider to have learned. She knew the pet names the family used for each other. When Gleb Botkin, the son of the family physician who had played with Anastasia as a child, met her, she asked about his funny animals. Years earlier, Botkin had drawn Anastasia pictures of animals wearing court clothes. How could she have known about that unless she was who she claimed to be? Over the following years, Anna Anderson gathered a devoted circle of supporters. Some were Russian émigrés who wanted desperately to believe that someone from the old world had survived. Some were aristocrats drawn to the romantic mystery. Some were journalists and writers who saw a great story. Some were simply kind people who felt sorry for this damaged woman. They gave her money. They gave her places to live. They gave her their belief. Grand Duke Andrei Vladimirovich, a cousin of Nicholas II, was convinced she was genuine. Princess Xenia Georgievna supported her for years. Gleb Botkin became her most devoted advocate, championing her cause until the end of his life. Anna lived in castles and grand houses across Europe, moving from one believer's home to the next. When her welcome wore out in one place, another benefactor would appear. For someone who might have been a penniless impostor, she managed to live remarkably well. But not everyone was convinced. The surviving Romanovs were split. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, Nicholas's youngest sister who had known Anastasia since childhood, met Anna Anderson in 1925. She spent 4 days with her, and her conclusion was definitive. This woman was not her niece. My telling the truth does not help in the least, Olga later said, because the public simply wants to believe the mystery. Pierre Gilliard, the family's French tutor who had known Anastasia for years, also rejected the claim. He called Anna a cunning psychopath. Princess Irene of Hesse, the Tsarina's sister, was equally certain. Anna was an impostor, the pattern was telling. Those who had known Anastasia intimately, who had spent years in her presence, generally rejected Anna's claims. Those who believed were often people who had known the Grand Duchess only slightly or not at all. But the strongest evidence against Anna came from a private investigation. In 1927, Ernest Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, the Tsarina's brother, hired a private detective to investigate Anna Anderson's identity. The detective's conclusion: Anna was actually Franziska Sanskowska, a Polish factory worker who had disappeared in 1920. The evidence was compelling. Sanskowska had worked in a Berlin munitions factory during World War I. In 1916, a grenade had fallen from her hand and exploded, killing a foreman and severely injuring her. She had suffered head trauma and was declared insane. She spent time in mental institutions. Shortly before Anna Anderson appeared in the Berlin Canal, Franziska Sanskowska had disappeared from her lodgings. The timeline matched. The injuries matched. The mental instability matched. When Franziska's brother Felix was brought to meet Anna Anderson, he initially said she resembled his sister. Later, he would claim he had recognized her immediately, but had chosen to let her continue her new life. Anna denied everything. She refused to meet with the Sanskowska family. She continued to insist she was Anastasia. The investigation's findings were published in German newspapers. For most observers, the case should have been closed. But Anna had her believers, and they weren't ready to give up. In 1938, Anna Anderson filed a lawsuit in Germany seeking legal recognition as Grand Duchess Anastasia. The case dragged on for decades. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented. Experts testified about handwriting analysis, facial comparison, medical history. It became the longest-running civil case in German history. Both sides claimed victories. A German doctor who examined photographs of Anna and Anastasia declared that such coincidence between two human faces is not possible unless they are the same person or identical twins. A handwriting expert said their scripts were identical, but other experts reached opposite conclusions. The surviving Romanovs testified against her. The Sanskowska connection was documented extensively. In 1970, the German Supreme Court finally issued its verdict. Anna Anderson had failed to prove she was Anastasia. But, and this was crucial, she had also not been proven not to be Anastasia. The court's ruling was essentially, we don't know who this woman is. The mystery remained officially unsolved. Anna declared victory. Her supporters celebrated she had not been definitively debunked. She would spend the rest of her life insisting she was the Grand Duchess. In 1968, Anna Anderson moved to the United States. She was in her 70s now, or her 60s if she was really Anastasia. The age difference was one of many inconsistencies in her story. Her health was declining. Her circle of European supporters had shrunk. But she found a new champion, John Manahan, a wealthy history professor from Charlottesville, Virginia. Shortly before her visa was due to expire, she married him. The Manahans became local celebrities and local eccentrics. They lived in a house on University Circle that gradually descended into squalor. They had dozens of dogs and cats. Neighbors complained about the smell. The city fined them for rat harborage. Anna, whom Jack always called Anastasia, could be heard screaming at her husband in heavily accented English. When asked about her identity in a 1978 interview, she said, "How shall I tell you who I am? In which way? Can you tell me that? Can you really prove to me who you are? You can believe it or you don't believe it. It doesn't matter." By 1983, she was gravely ill. A judge appointed a legal guardian after determining that Jack could no longer provide adequate care. She died on February 12, 1984. Her body was cremated, but unlike most stories, Anna Anderson's didn't end with her death. In 1979, during a surgery for an intestinal blockage, doctors at Martha Jefferson Hospital in Charlottesville had removed a tissue sample from Anna Anderson. Following standard procedure, they preserved it. After her death, that tissue sample sat in storage, waiting. In 1991, a mass grave was discovered near Yekaterinburg, Russia. 9 bodies, the Tsar, the Tsarina, 3 daughters, and 4 servants. DNA testing began. The Romanov remains were compared to living relatives, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who was related to the Tsarina through her mother's line. The match was conclusive. The bodies were genuine, but 2 of the Romanov children were still missing, and there was still that tissue sample in Virginia. In 1994, researchers obtained the preserved sample and tested it. They compared Anna Anderson's mitochondrial DNA to the Romanov remains and to living Romanov relatives. The result was unambiguous. Anna Anderson was not related to the Romanovs, not even distantly. Her DNA didn't match the family at all. But the scientists went further. They also compared her DNA to Karl Malka, a great-nephew of Franziska Zanskowska. It matched. Anna Anderson was Franziska Zanskowska. The Polish factory worker, the woman with the head injury, the person the private detective had identified in 1927. The mystery: she had never been Anastasia, not for a single moment of those decades of claims and lawsuits and grand living. She was a mentally ill factory worker who had assumed an identity and never let it go. But by the time the DNA results were published, Anna was dead. She had spent her entire adult life as the Grand Duchess. She had died believing, or at least claiming to believe, that she was royalty, and some of her supporters refused to accept even the DNA evidence. Anna Anderson was the most famous Anastasia claimant. She was not the only one. At least a dozen women publicly claimed to be the missing Grand Duchess over the course of the 20th century. Some achieved momentary fame. Some gathered small circles of believers. All were eventually proven false. The sheer number raises questions. Why so many? What drove these women to claim an identity that wasn't theirs? The answers vary. Some were clearly mentally ill. The trauma of the early 20th century, the war, the revolution, the upheaval, left many people displaced, confused, unable to anchor themselves to their own histories. Claiming to be Anastasia gave them an identity when their real identities had been destroyed. Some were con artists. The rumored Romanov fortune, supposedly held in foreign banks, was an obvious draw. If you could prove you were the last surviving heir, that money was yours. The fact that the fortune probably didn't exist in the form people imagined didn't stop people from trying, and some may have been victims of suggestion. In the chaos after the revolution, many displaced people looked like they might be Russian aristocrats. They had the bearing, the manners, the speech patterns of the upper class. When someone suggested they might be the missing princess, perhaps they started to believe it themselves. The line between deliberate fraud and genuine delusion is often impossible to draw. The second most famous Anastasia imposter was Eugenia Smith. Unlike Anna Anderson, who was discovered half drowned in a canal, Eugenia actively publicized her claim. In 1963, she approached a New York publisher with a manuscript she said contained her memories of life as the Grand Duchess. The publisher was skeptical. They demanded she take a lie detector test. First, Eugenia claimed she was merely a close friend of Anastasia who had been given the princess's notes. Under this claim, she failed the polygraph. Then she changed her story. She wasn't Anastasia's friend. She was Anastasia herself. Under this claim, she passed. The publisher went forward. Anastasia. Unlike Anna Anderson, who was reclusive and difficult, Eugenia embraced the spotlight. She appeared at society parties, she gave interviews, she lived well, supported by wealthy believers. She even had a tearful reunion with Michael Golanowski, a former Polish intelligence officer who claimed to be Tsarevich Alexei, Anastasia's brother. The two impostors embraced before photographers and confirmed each other's identities. They later had a falling out. Eugenia denounced Golanowski as a fraud. He continued to insist she was his sister until his death. Eugenia never submitted to DNA testing during her lifetime. She died in 1997, just months before the final Romanov remains were discovered. Why did people believe them? Not just the impostors themselves, but their supporters. The aristocrats who housed them, the devotees who funded them, the journalists who championed them. Modern research into scam victims offers some insight. People who fall for cons often share certain traits. They want to believe. They've invested emotionally in a narrative. The more they've committed to the story, financially, socially, reputationally, the harder it becomes to admit they've been deceived. The Anastasia imposters offered something powerful, a happy ending to a horror story. They represented hope that evil hadn't completely triumphed. They gave people something to believe in. Once someone had publicly declared that Anna Anderson or Eugenia Smith was the real Anastasia. Admitting error meant admitting they'd been fooled. It meant acknowledging that the princess was really dead, that the basement horror was final, that there was no miracle. Most people couldn't do it. They forgave inconsistencies in the imposters' stories. They explained away failed tests and contradictory evidence. They attacked the credibility of doubters rather than questioning their own beliefs. Evidence. The Anastasia saga isn't just a mystery story. It's a study in how badly people need to believe and how far they'll go to protect that belief from reality. Even after the DNA evidence, some people refuse to accept the truth. When Anna Anderson's test results were published in 1994, her remaining supporters claimed the samples had been contaminated or switched. They argued that the hospital tissue might not really have been Anna's. They suggested elaborate conspiracies to hide the real results. A Facebook page titled Anna Anderson was Anastasia Romanov exists to this day. Eugenia Smith's believers similarly refused to accept her exposure. They pointed to the lie detector test she passed. They cited the expertise of their own analysts. They questioned the motives of everyone involved in debunking her. This is the nature of belief. Once someone has committed to a position, especially a position that's become part of their identity, evidence against it often strengthens rather than weakens their commitment. The psychology is well documented. Alexander Avdonin, a Russian geologist, had spent years researching the family's disappearance. Using historical accounts and geographic analysis, he identified a probable burial site in the Koptyaki forest near Yekaterinburg. He dug, he found bones, and then he reburied them. This was the Soviet Union. Questioning the official narrative of the execution was dangerous. Revealing that you'd found the Romanovs' remains could bring unwanted attention from the government. Avdonin decided to wait. He waited until the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, with the Communist Party no longer in power, Avdonin finally revealed his discovery. An official excavation was conducted. The bones were exhumed. What they found was grim. 9 skeletons jumbled together in a shallow pit. The skulls were damaged. Many had been smashed, probably to prevent identification. The bones showed evidence of acid damage and burning. These people had not simply been buried. Someone had tried very hard to make sure they couldn't be identified, but modern forensic science had advanced since 1918. Identifying the remains required multiple approaches. First, forensic anthropologists analyzed the bones themselves, determined the sex and approximate age of each skeleton. They looked for evidence of injuries or medical conditions that might match known facts about the Romanovs. The results were suggestive but not conclusive. There were 2 adults who could be the Tsar and Tsarina. There were 3 females in the right age range for the older daughters. There were 4 others who could be the servants. But which daughter was which? And where were the 2 missing children? DNA testing provided the answer. The scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from the bones and compared it to living relatives. Prince Philip of Edinburgh provided a sample. He was related to the Tsarina through her grandmother, Queen Victoria. The match was positive. The bodies were the Romanovs. But the testing also revealed something troubling. Only 3 of the daughters were present, and the Tsarevich was missing entirely. 2 bodies, Alexei and one of his sisters, had been buried somewhere else. The Anastasia myth, which should have died with this discovery, found new oxygen. If one daughter was missing, couldn't it have been Anastasia? Couldn't she have escaped after all? The Russian forensic team believed Maria was the missing sister. American experts disagreed. They thought it was Anastasia. The argument wouldn't be settled for another 16 years. In 2007, 3 amateur archaeologists were searching the forest near the original burial site. About 70 meters away from the mass grave, they found something: 44 bone fragments and several teeth buried in a shallow pit. The remains were badly damaged. They had been burned and doused with acid even more thoroughly than the bodies in the main grave. But enough DNA remained for testing. The results came back in 2008. The fragments belonged to 2 people, a teenage boy and a young woman. The boy's Y chromosome matched the Tsar. The mitochondrial DNA of both matched the Tsarina. Alexei and his sister had been found. Further analysis determined that the sister was probably Maria, confirming the Russian forensic team's original conclusion. The 3 daughters in the main grave were Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. Every member of the Romanov family had now been accounted for. There were no survivors. There had never been any survivors. Every imposter, every claimant, every woman who said she'd escaped the basement, all of them had been lying or deluded. The story was over. The myth, of course, continued. The Romanov remains were given a state funeral in 1998 before the final 2 bodies were discovered. It was a strange event. The Russian government acknowledged the family's murder, but expressed no clear opinion about who was responsible. The Russian Orthodox Church refused to participate, citing doubts about the identification of the remains. The bodies were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, alongside the Romanov ancestors who had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. Nicholas II, who had never wanted to be a Tsar, lay beneath the same roof as Peter the Great. When Alexei and Maria were finally identified in 2007, questions arose about what to do with them. Should they join their family in St. Petersburg? The church continued to express doubts. The government was non-committal. As of this recording, the remains of Alexei and Maria have still not been buried with their family. They remain in state custody, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. Even in death, even with their identities proven beyond any reasonable doubt, the family cannot find rest. In 1997, an animated film called Anastasia was released. It was not made by Disney, though it's often confused for a Disney product. It was produced by 21st Century Fox's animation studio, directed by Don Bluth and Gary Goldman, former Disney animators who were explicitly trying to compete with their old employer. The film tells a story that is charitably, loosely inspired by history. In the movie version, the Romanov family is attacked by Rasputin, here reimagined as a literally demonic sorcerer who sold his soul for the power to destroy them. Young Anastasia escapes the assault with the help of a servant boy named Dmitri. She loses her memory and grows up as an orphan named Anya, unaware of her true identity. Years later, she meets the adult Dmitri, who now a con man planning to present a fake Anastasia to the Dowager Empress for a reward. Neither realizes Anya actually is Anastasia. Adventures ensue. Rasputin is defeated. Anastasia reunites with her grandmother. She and Dmitri fall in love. Happy ending. The film made $140 million at the box office. It was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. It spawned a Broadway musical that opened in 2017. For millions of people, this is the Anastasia story they know. Consider when this film was released, 1997. 3 years after science definitively established that there were no Romanov survivors. The filmmakers knew the truth. They knew the myth had been debunked. They made their movie anyway. In fairness, they weren't claiming historical accuracy. This was a fantasy, a fairy tale, a deliberate reimagining. The villain was a magic-wielding undead monk. No one was supposed to think this was documentary. But the choice to tell this particular fantasy at this particular moment is revealing. The DNA results hadn't killed the Anastasia myth. If anything, by definitively closing the case, they'd made the myth more appealing. Now the survival story was purely fiction. And fiction has no obligation to facts. The animated Anastasia couldn't possibly be real. Everyone knew that. And somehow, that made her more popular than ever. He sold his soul for power, and he uses that power to do evil things. The real story has villains too, but they're more complicated. There's Lenin, who ordered the execution because he couldn't risk the Romanovs becoming a rallying point for counter-revolution. There's the Ural Soviet, which carried out the order with brutal efficiency. There are the individual executioners, Yurovsky and his men, who shot and stabbed 11 people to death in a basement. But there are also the systemic villains. The centuries of autocratic rule that made revolution inevitable. The incompetent governance that lost the war and starved the people. The vast inequality that made the Romanovs' wealth obscene while peasants froze and starved. Nicholas wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a weak man in an impossible position, doing his best, which wasn't nearly good enough to hold together a system that was already falling apart. Alexandra wasn't a villain either. She was a devoted mother consumed by her son's illness. Even Rasputin, the real one, wasn't evil. He was a faith healer who found himself with influence he didn't know how to handle. The murder in the basement was a crime. It was also the culmination of decades of misrule, exploitation, and suffering. The Romanovs didn't deserve to die, but the system they represented was crushing millions. The animated film doesn't engage with any of this. It replaces history's complexity with a simple story. Bad guy tried to kill princess, princess escaped, princess found love, the end. That's not wrong, it's just empty. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanov family. Not as martyrs. That designation was considered and rejected. Martyrs die for their faith, and the Romanovs were killed for political reasons. Instead, they were declared passion bearers, a category for those who accepted death with Christian humility. The canonization was controversial. The Romanovs' role in Russia's suffering, the pogroms, the famines, the disastrous war, sat uneasily with sainthood. Critics argued that whitewashing them as holy innocents was as misleading as the animated film. But the decision reflected something important. Russia was trying to reckon with its past. The Romanovs weren't just murder victims. They were symbols of the old regime, of the violence that ended it, of everything that had happened since. Making them saints was one way of processing that history, of finding meaning in the senselessness. Whether it was the right way is debatable. But it was at least an attempt to do something other than ignore the story entirely. We've talked about myths and movies and imposters and DNA. We've analyzed the psychology of belief and the politics of revolution. We've traced the story through a century of claims and counterclaims. But at the center of all of it is a person we've barely discussed, Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov, a girl who was born into impossible privilege and impossible constraints, who grew up in palaces but slept on a hard camp bed, who was surrounded by servants but genuinely loved by her family, who was mischievous and funny and sharp-tongued and occasionally cruel. She was 17 when she died. She had never been in love. She had never lived on her own. She had never had to make any of the choices that define an adult life. All she'd had was her family. The sister she signed letters with as OTMA. The brother she distracted from his pain. The father who adored her. The mother who was too consumed by worry to see her clearly. And then, one night, strangers came into a basement and took all of that away. She didn't escape. She didn't survive. She didn't grow up to find her grandmother and fall in love and live happily ever after. She died, afraid, in the dark, surrounded by smoke and screaming, reaching for someone who couldn't save her. That's the story, not the myth, not the movie, not the imposter's claims, just a 17-year-old girl who deserved better and didn't get it. We've reached the end of this story, and I want to leave you with a question. What do we owe the dead? The easy answer is remember them. Tell their stories. Don't let them be forgotten. And there's truth in that. Anastasia deserves to be remembered, not as a myth, not as a cartoon, but as the person she actually was. But I think we owe the dead something harder than memory. We owe them honesty. The Anastasia myth is a lie, not a malicious lie. Exactly. Most of the people who believed it meant well, but a lie nonetheless. A story we told ourselves because the truth was unbearable. And here's the thing about comfortable lies. They steal something from the people they're supposed to honor. The real Anastasia. The imp. The mimic. The girl who climbed trees in her court dress gets erased by the cartoon princess. Her actual life, with all its complexity and constraint, gets replaced by a fantasy of escape and romance. We don't have to sit with the horror of what happened to her because we've invented a version where it didn't happen. The imposters did the same thing, in their way. Anna Anderson spent 60 years wearing Anastasia's name like a costume. She got the attention, the support, the identity that should have been Anastasia's. She lived the life the real princess never got to have. And she did it by claiming to be her. That's what comfortable lies do. They let us off the hook. They let us feel good about a story that should make us feel terrible. They replace difficult truth with easy fiction. And in doing so, they erase the real person at the center. Here's what the Anastasia myth lets us avoid. A 17-year-old girl was murdered in a basement, and nobody was ever punished for it. The executioners lived out their lives. Yurovsky died in 1938 of natural causes, celebrated by the Soviet state as a revolutionary hero. His men scattered. Some died in the Civil War. Some lived to old age. None faced consequences for what they did. Lenin, who ordered the killing, died in 1924 and was embalmed and displayed in a mausoleum that still exists today. The system that made the murder possible, the revolutionary government that decided entire families could be erased for political convenience, went on to kill millions more. Stalin, the purges, the gulags. The Romanov execution wasn't an aberration. It was a template. There was no justice. There was no reckoning. The people who killed a family of 7 and their 4 servants got away with it completely. The Anastasia myth lets us avoid sitting with that injustice. If she escaped, then at least someone got away. If she survived, then evil didn't win completely. If there's a happy ending somewhere, then we don't have to face the horror of a story with no redemption. But there is no happy ending. There was no escape. Evil won. And we have to live with that. Why do we need Anastasia to have survived? I've asked this question several times tonight, and I want to try to answer it now. The Romanov execution is a story about complete helplessness. A family, parents and children were taken to a basement and shot. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't escape. They couldn't even protect each other. The bullets came and the bayonets came, and there was nothing anyone could do. We hate that story. We hate it because it could happen to us. Most of us spend our lives believing on some level that we have control, that if we're smart enough or strong enough or lucky enough, we can avoid catastrophe, that there's always a way out, always a chance to survive, always something we can do. The Romanov basement says otherwise. It says that sometimes there's no escape. Sometimes the doors close and the guns come out, and that's it. No miracle, no rescue, no happy ending. The Anastasia myth is our rebellion against that truth. It's us saying no, someone got out, someone survived. The universe isn't that cruel, that random, that indifferent to innocence. But the universe is exactly that cruel. And pretending otherwise doesn't change anything. It just makes us less able to face reality when it matters. Let me tell you one more thing about Anastasia. In the months before her death, while imprisoned in Tobolsk and then Yekaterinburg, she found ways to stay herself. She put on plays for her parents, comedies that made everyone laugh. She helped in the kitchen, learning to bake bread for the first time in her life. She charmed some of the guards, annoyed others, remained irrepressibly herself. One guard remembered her doing comic mimes with the dogs as though they were performing in a circus. She was still the imp, still the schwibzik, even as her world contracted to a few rooms in a merchant's house, even as the future narrowed to uncertainty and fear, she was still making jokes. That's who she was. Not a myth, not a symbol, not a princess in a cartoon, a 17-year-old girl who responded to imprisonment and terror by trying to make people laugh. She deserved better than she got. She deserved to grow up, to fall in love, to have a life. She deserved not to die in a basement at the hands of men who saw her as a political problem to be solved. She didn't deserve what we've done to her since. The imposters wearing her name, the myths obscuring her reality, the century of lies that replaced her with a fantasy. The best thing we can do for Anastasia now is to tell the truth, to remember her as she was, to sit with the horror of what happened and not look away. She lived, she died. No magic rescued her. No secret passage led to freedom. She was 17 and men shot her in a basement, and that's the end. We've been in the dark tonight. We've walked through palaces and prisons, through basements and courtrooms, through myths and lies and hard truths. We've met a family that was murdered and the women who claimed to have escaped. We've watched science close doors that hope wanted to keep open. If this story has taught us anything, it's that comfortable lies come with a cost. Every time we choose the myth over the truth, we lose something. The real person, the real history, the real lessons we might have learned. Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov was not a cartoon princess. She was a girl who loved her family, made people laugh, and died too young. That's a tragedy, and we shouldn't need to dress it up as a fairy tale to make it bearable. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes there is no escape. Sometimes all we can do is remember what really happened and refuse to let the lies win too. The next time someone mentions Anastasia, the movie, the musical, the myth, remember the girl in the basement. Remember what was done to her. Remember that she never got out. And maybe that memory, that honest reckoning with the truth, is the only justice we can offer her now. Until next